So sorry for the delay. On behalf of Atri, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to Sibyl Diver, who's here because of our serendipitous encounter that again reinforces the fact that we're all part of a very small but very powerful universe of people pushing the boundaries of both conservation and development. I met Sibyl last year at a conference held at Kenya, aptly titled The Commons We Want. Interestingly, it was her panel and her colleagues and her students that I made a note of before leaving India. And I had circled them saying, oh, I must attend these panels. And then I met her. And as I was explaining to some of you, that I used to chit chat at the informal spaces, lunch and tea and various things without recognizing that her work is so phenomenal. And a lot of people would come and ask for her card and introduce her to introduce their work to her and get to know her. And then I realized that she is quite something because her work on the intersection of Adivasi or Indigenous well-being, co-management of natural resources, and advocacy for people in conservation speaks so much to our work at A-Tree that I was so delighted to know that she's visiting Bangalore, and I would love to have her come and talk to us. I have a formal introduction, which is a slightly different from what is there in the blurb that was sent out to all of you. But I'll just read a few lines and then her work will speak for herself. Sibyl is, of course, an interdisciplinary environmental scientist. She's a lecturer at Stanford University in the Earth Systems program. She's also the co-lead of the Stanford Environmental Justice Working Group. Her PhD is from Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, where she had the Karuk, is that how you say it? Okay, Karuk UC Berkeley Collaborative, a group supporting the Karuk tribe's ecocultural revitalization strategy in Northern California. Her research is on indigenous water governance, focusing on Pacific Northwestern salmon watersheds, which she will speak to us about today. Lastly, I also want to highlight her Russian connection, mostly because of her bioregionalism approach around the North Pacific to conservation. Sibyl spent 8 years doing international conservation work and facilitating international exchanges with community leaders as a Russian translator. What a fun job. And I'm very, very happy again to welcome you to Atri, to Bangalore, to India, and giving your vacation time to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as Pallavi mentioned, when we were at the Commons conference, we met, and all of a sudden there were all of these connections, and I started to learn more about Atri. I have a student, Tanvi Gupta, who has told me about this organization, and I can't believe that I'm standing here in this moment and getting to meet some of the folks here who are really doing exciting interdisciplinary work. And I'm excited for the opportunity to learn more from you in being here, even though I have the stage for the moment. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'll speak for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then we can invite some exchange, which is often the best part of these interactions. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge just my appreciation of being here as a guest, the Pallavi and Atri, and all of you, and thank you for coming and spending your time here. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, who are coming from the Karuk tribe, Stanford University, and UC Berkeley. Particularly Ron Reed, who is my mentor. He is Karuk, he's a traditional dip net fisherman, and I'll be speaking about Klamath dam removal. But Ron Reed was one of the first advocates for the tribe that was arguing for dam removal in this case 20 years ago, before anyone really believed it would happen. And he's been a really important friend and mentor to me. So I want to appreciate him and acknowledge that often we try to co-present together. Today it's just me, but I'm maybe inviting him in spirit. And I also want to share maybe 3 caveats. So I will be speaking about dam removal today, but this is a dam that produces very little hydroelectric power. That was the original purpose, but it's not a significant amount of electricity. It's also a set of dams that do not provide much flood control or irrigation waters, and there's no sort of water diversions for home use, right? So it's a particular opportunity to take out these dams that are really no longer useful in their purpose and for what they were built. Also, I want to highlight that the decision to remove dams has already occurred. It already occurred before I started this assessment. So this is not part of a government assessment process. This is part of a social assessment in partnership with the Indigenous communities, one of the Indigenous communities of this area, for the purpose of understanding how the dam removal process will impact them. So I want to clarify that. So with that, I'll jump into it. So the title is Social Assessment of Klamath Dam Removal with the Karuk Tribe, including Indigenous Communities in Environmental Governance. And I'll be talking about this assessment really as a co-design process, focusing on tribal community well-being. And the dam removal process in this case is happening very much because of tribal community advocacy, which has occurred over about 20 years before the decision to take out the dams was actually finalized, and 3 sets of settlement agreements. So this is quite a prolonged and difficult political process, and it's really the tribe's sort of political advocacy that has pushed it forward. And the project is also about really looking beyond the biophysical changes in dam removal to think about what does dam removal really mean for the Karuk community, for this community that was really at the center of arguing for this and making it happen in the first place. So that's the context for this study. And so I'll start with some of the research motivation and share some of the story or the case context of the Klamath dams, and then get into the research around our tribal assessment method and a short outline of just some of our findings. So I'll highlight that for you, but I am glad to talk at more detail afterwards, whether here or on email. And this is a picture of as I mentioned, my colleague Ron Reed and his son Ryan, who was 8 years old when I met him, and now he's doing his master's in forestry at UC Berkeley. So this is a pretty exceptional family. We've known each other for some time. This is their dip net fishing location at Ishipishi Falls, and this is near what in the Karuk tradition is called the center of the world. It's where the Klamath River sort of meets the Salmon River, and it's a very important both fishing location and cultural location for the tribe. And this is really what we're here to talk about today. It's the people living in relationship with the river and how that's continuing over time in a particular place. And I hope that this might relate to some of the really exciting work that I'm just starting to read about at H3 in terms of some of the work you do with nature culture, some of your innovations in studying Indigenous conserved areas and community capacity building, and just also some of the insights and opportunities that it looks like you're really laying the groundwork for on ecological restoration and human well-being. I feel like all those things really spoke to me as areas I'd like to learn more about in your work. So Pallavi already provided such a generous introduction. Thank you. But just to situate myself further, I have Irish, English, German heritage, so I come to this work from an allied perspective. I started, as Pallavi mentioned, learning about Indigenous rights as they connect to salmon or fish protection as a translator. So it was really language that allowed me to sort of learn from grassroots community leaders. And I consider my role to still be very much that of a translator, and bringing some of the relationships that I've had the really privilege of developing over time, bringing those relationships into research, and this idea that perhaps we can do more to bring Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems into assessment and into our science. So that's very much part of the motivation of this work. And I think some of the excitement behind this goal of bringing Indigenous knowledge into assessment, into science, into environmental governance is that we really, we can feel some gaps in our understanding. And in this case, we're doing that through studying the dam removal process and really leveraging the community's knowledge and experience in this place to think about how biophysical effects are really flowing into the social aspects of these infrastructure projects. And I've noted some of the project origins here, the purpose of interrupting the exclusion of Indigenous peoples in assessment in our science processes. We're also responding directly to a community request from both the scientific and the tribal research community for social assessment. There's been some similar dam removal efforts happening in two states to the north of us, in California, in Washington, with the Elwha Dam coming out before these mid-Klamath dams. And folks did a lot to study the biophysical changes, but there was no real baseline on, well, where were the community? Where were the social issues before this major intervention occurred? What does it mean for people when you make these massive changes to your biophysical and social system, which we know are interconnected? And the last thing, we were very fortunate to have a planning grant that helped us really scope out this study for about a year with the community. So we really could make this a community-centered project. So to share the research framework, we're really interested in other meaningful assessment work with Indigenous communities that's come before us, and we stand on the shoulders of some of those individuals, including Jamie Donatuto, who's also done some really cool work around Indigenous health, and colleagues from Alaska, another really important place for salmon, with Rachel Donkersloot, Jessica Black, Courtney Carruthers, who have laid out some of these domains of well-being and how they relate to Indigenous salmon cultures already. So we're building on this. The domains of tribal community well-being that we're studying in this project are access to cultural resources, holistic health, livelihoods, education, and self-governance. So we're tailoring some of the studies to really meet the conversations that we've had with Cutter community partners. And we'll talk more about these through the talk. So to move on now to the case context, the Cutter tribe is, it is a federally recognized tribe in our US political system. It's also the second largest tribe in California, which is the state where I'm studying and working. And their Aboriginal territory is 1.4 million acres. Because of the history of really enclosure and displacement of Indigenous peoples in our state, they do not have a reservation area. And that's because there were a set of treaties signed by Indian agents going to meet with tribal representatives that were never ratified at the federal level. So there's no reservation in this context, although you can see the trust lands, which are small areas that add up to maybe 1 square, like a couple square kilometers that are along the Klamath River there. But you'll notice that the green color signifies that the majority of the land is now claimed as national forest land by the federal government. So that's kind of the backdrop, and for the folks interested in political ecology, some of the enclosure questions that come in for this case. A big motivation for dam removal occurred in 2002, so some time ago, when poor water quality conditions led to a major fish kill with 40 to 80,000 adult salmon and steelhead dying without spawning in the lower Klamath. And this tragedy was really precipitated by upriver agricultural diversions in a drought year. And that led to an outbreak of fish disease in the lower basin. And so for tribes here who are salmon cultures, like the Cutter tribe, this was a really devastating event. And it led for the tribes to engage in a series of sort of scientific studies, including the study in the middle portrayed here, with Ron Reed partnered with my colleague, Dr. Kari Norgard, to study the effects of altered diet, where dams and the loss of fish and other traditional foods were connected to disproportionately high rates of diet-related disease like diabetes in the community. That hit some of our major newspapers and was sort of a helpful starting point in pushing for the initial political will to take out these dams. And that led to a first set of settlement agreements in 2010. And this is Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is our governor in California at the time, who was saying hasta la vista to the Klamath dams. But you'll note that this is 2010, and it took another 10 years for a set of current settlement agreements to actually come to fruition for dam removal to take place. So after 2 decades of tribal advocacy, science, and policy, working with allies, we now see the removal of 4, and you can see them in that purple line, 4 dams in the middle section of the Klamath River that are coming out, and this process began just last summer. So it's quite new. And I'll note that there are 2 remaining dams in the upper section of the river. These dams have fish ladders associated with them, so the fish can get up and around. The dams that are coming out do not. So this is for the first time, the river is running free for the first time in about 100 years since they've opened up the channels and drained the reservoirs behind these 4 dams. So that's already happening. And you can see some of the tribal advocacy really asking in this sort of final political push, sign the agreements to take the Klamath down, and some of the first infrastructural removal happening for one of those dams. And I failed to note that there's sort of 2 key issues with these dams. One is that they were built without fish ladders, so they prevent fish passage, they prevent connectivity in the ecological system, and really block off about 350 miles of river for salmon spawning. So this is a really big deal. The other issue is, you saw this earlier, but the dams create these large reservoirs that are big warm bathtubs, and they create harmful algal blooms that are flowing downriver. And that's a health hazard for wildlife and people. And they also just disrupt the ecological processes that are related to river natural disturbance processes with flushing flows that would normally come through. So those are the issues with the dams. And now you can see this is a spot right above that first removed area where the river is finding its original channel, and the orange spots are California poppies. They've done a lot of reseeding for those who are interested in restoration. After the draining of the reservoirs, sort of you've got these big black patches of sediment on either sides of the river. And the first thing that people did was try to reseed with native plants. So this is sort of a picture from the spring when all of a sudden new growth. So that's kind of exciting. So moving into the assessment, the really major contribution of our assessment is bringing Karuk people and Karuk knowledge in to understanding dam removal, to making this assessment together, and recasting dam removal as an ecocultural revitalization process. So it's not just about the infrastructure removal. It's not just about a single species or salmon restoration. While that's important, it's about introducing Karuk worldviews into how we do assessment and environmental governance, and also shifting how we understand the dam removal when these biophysical changes with dam removal are very interconnected with Karuk social and cultural practices and community well-being. So there's a lot at stake for an Indigenous community in this process that extends pretty far beyond what we would catch in a standard biophysical study. And some of this is exemplified here. You see one of our co-authors, Carolyn Smith. Carolyn is a weaver And she's also a professional, a professor in anthropology at UC Berkeley. And she's gathering willow roots and sticks. She's a Karuk descendant. And these are materials that are used to weave baby rattles, shown here, and baby baskets. And those are important in contemporary Karuk culture and really holding the youngest community members in their first years. And they sit in those baskets and they observe and they watch what's happening in the community. And that's the learning. And the baskets also, if you read Carolyn's work, they hold the spirit of the river and the Karuk people as interconnected entities. And these are materials from the river, materials of the place where the Indigenous community comes from. So the work wouldn't have happened without some of the, really long-term existing relationships among our team. And this is a picture of me in my younger years with some of the founders of the Karuk Tribe UC Berkeley Collaborative. And that was something that started when I began graduate school around 2008, 2009, where the university, some leaders in the university organized, after meeting Ron Reed, one of my mentors, they organized to think about how could we create a formal partnership between the university and the tribe, really to develop synergistic initiatives, mobilize some of the resources and connections that we have in the university to forward the ecocultural revitalization goals of the tribe. So that's still going. That started about 15 years ago, and that was how I got involved in this work, moving from Russia into the California context. And there's another picture of us shown here more recently. And I'll note this is Tom Carlson and Ron, some of the co-founders for the collaborative. On the left with our colleague, Lucia Liu, who was one of the designers for some early timeline work that we did as a collaborative research project to get to know one another. And then these are some of our colleagues meeting with weavers on the riverbank with tribal managers and our research team to really discuss what was needed with this study. And we tried to have some of those discussions in the place on the riverbank where we were looking at some of these overgrown willow stands that are really not usable for the weaver community. They really require those flushing flows that would happen in the spring to tear out willow and create more healthy materials. So the research approach, again, we had a pretty diverse team, and this is our group. All the folks who helped make this happen. We started with the scoping conversations and combined a set of focus groups with fisheries, cultural practitioners, basket weavers, tribal leadership, and youth. And a survey that we sent to almost 8,000 tribal community members. And we did this project in the 6-month period, really before the dam removal, the physical infrastructure removal started. So this is an ongoing process. We're seeing this as a baseline assessment, really to catch this moment of what are the goals, what are the hopes of this community, what is it they see as relevant for them after investing 20 years in getting to this point, but before the actual infrastructure removal is happening. So we then began, we then began the work. So I'll just share a few highlights so that we can have some discussion. And the survey response was pretty diverse. It was really exciting, and we had a good time with our focus groups because we got to really have some intimate conversations, especially with the youth. It was really fun talking with the youth from like different sections of the community because this community is spread out. So we really tried to have those in-person conversations. But the survey meant that we could reach a really diverse set of folks. So we talked to Karuk tribal members who are now distributed all over the country, right? So some people are on the river, but this is also community in diaspora. And we sort of sorted our data around folks who were, 3 hours or so driving distance from the river, and those who are a bit further away. You couldn't necessarily get to the river in a day. So we're really happy about that diversity. And also those three different colors are showing 3 different council districts, which are the political districts established by this tribe so that they ensure sort of a democratic governance that's representing some of the family structures that have always made up the tribe. So again, let's see, we're working with these domains of tribal community well-being, and I'm not going to hit all of them, but I'll speak to cultural resources and holistic health. But if you have questions about the other ones, I'm happy to share more. So around cultural resources, folks really shared a lot about how much they had lost in terms of their access to the rivers and to the fish, and the importance of restoring access and restoring relationships between human and non-human entities in the river was a huge priority for folks. And here's what people had to say. I want to see the people sitting along the river joining their families because we don't see that anymore. We had a really good year this year, and yet we still didn't have enough for subsistence needs. We barely had enough for ceremonial needs. And here's a youth participant talking about how the dam removal will help my relationship to the river and my dad, right? So the river and the place is mediating the relations in families and in the community. The other cool thing that we saw was that the survey was demonstrating a lot of the richness and diverse cultural resources that are really being used in the community. And the use is occurring across all seasons and all segments of the river. It's not just one thing, it's not just one time, and it's still there. The community is still there. So cultural resources, you can see some of the traditional uses, fishing, hunting, eeling, gathering, medicine, basket materials, or other foods, but it also includes ceremony. And we included family time by the river as a cultural use, family outings, swimming, recreational boating, right? Because that's how the community sees it. At the same time that people are using the river, they're experiencing a lot of barriers to cultural resource access. Dam removal was reported as the third highest barrier to cultural use for respondents. And we also started to see some of the variation, different kinds of barriers that were there across those 3 council districts. So this is a diverse community. It's not one thing. We tried to understand more of that nuance. As a baseline for this assessment, we only had 22% of local respondents saying they had enough access to meet their needs. So that's an important baseline. That's also, I'll note, like a personal, a self-reporting perception, right? What does someone need? Do they have what they need? So holistic health, a few findings, and then I'll wrap up. Folks were really thinking about the health of the river and the health of the community as being co-constituted, right? They enable each other. And they talked about diet and exercise that's associated with subsistence practices, also mental and spiritual health. And dam removal is anticipated to bring an effective shift away from some of the history that's really hard. There's a history of trauma in this area from the historical displacement of people from boarding schools and other assimilation efforts that folks are still dealing with. So when folks talk about the health, they said, I worry about tribal people getting their fish yearly, which is healthy, mentally, physical, and spiritually all together. Here's one of the medicine ceremonial leaders for the tribe saying, I had to bathe in the river for 10 days for ceremony. Well, one year the river was green. This is from those harmful algal blooms, like bright green. And that's the year when sometimes I swim and I get stuff in my ear or whatever. Well, my whole face swelled up. So this is sort of insult to injury because this is a person who's actively working to maintain culture and perform ceremonies on the river and experiencing a major health impairment, but yet they're still doing it, right? And lastly, it's become a known fact that you could be harmed by going near this river in the later months of the summer. So now our tradition is to pray for the river, to go and look at it and feel sadness when we look at it, right? So the health shifts that people are hoping to see are not just physical. It's like moving past the emotional despair that's there in the community. Some of the also additional baseline elements for health, 72% of respondents believe river conditions will at least somewhat contribute to health problems. And the majority of people said the river was not healthy or not healthy at all. And over half of the respondents shared that their mental health and well-being were at least somewhat affected by their feelings for the river. So this is that interconnectivity of health in the community. I'll end on some of the positive findings from talking to youth. And I think this really relates to conversations we were having this morning on education and how to bring youth into this work. The youth experiences and the focus groups were, really engaged, right? The youth have, we really try to engage the youth as experts on their own lives, and youth know a lot. They, in this case, they really are perceiving environmental decline occurring in in the scale of their own lifetime, and they're really concerned about cultural survival alongside the adults, and they recognize and feel their own responsibility for doing something about it. So one of the examples of what youth have done in this area is they organized a yearly salmon run where the youth get together, and they started this in 2002 after the fish kill, right? They wanted to do something, and they organized this relay style run that starts at the mouth of the river, and then it goes all the way up the river for 450 miles until the upper reaches of Klamath Lakes. And that purpose of that run is to really communicate to the salmon their commitment to return and the work that the youth are willing to do for that. And I think so people spoke to that. They spoke to, sort of their reference point. If folks who are restoration ecologists, the youth have knowledge about the reference point right now. And it's a little varied. You have some folks who said, I've always swam in rivers and creeks my whole life, right? I could just spend hours going to this spot where I jump into the river. And then others who said, I barely swim in the river. Folks in this area are more likely to swim in the tributaries, which are cleaner, flowing into the main stem. That's still available. We had kids talk about cultural continuity. They said, I want my family, I want my kids and my kids' kids to be able to swim in the Klamath. And they want the dam removal to help bring the youth back and make them more passionate about our culture. And then a last comment about the salmon run, really showing people how much it means. So this is really core, I think, to this finding is being able to talk to community member about the meaning. And so to wrap up here, we hope that our findings are contributing to some current work that's happening around developing tribal assessment science. And some of the key aspects of what we learned are first around the scoping process, to work with community in co-design for the assessment, so we're responding to their needs, and involving them in doing the work so that then they know what the work is and can use it. Second, ecocultural revitalization. This is really about centering people and their worldviews and knowledge systems and bringing that into revitalization work on the land. And then third, youth, involving youth as authorities on their own experience in the scientific work that we do. And that really adds a lot of energy, both to the learning and the science, and also to the implementation afterwards. We're already starting to talk to the youth about our findings, and they're already thinking about what they want to do. And finally, restorative justice, really thinking about the ability to establish a baseline for Cutter perceptions of social well-being that are linked to the dam removal and their hopes and dreams for this, in part so that there's something to look to. And hopefully we can do this study in 5 years and see some impacts, but there's some accountability brought in by doing the assessment and documenting where the community is at this point. So this is a intentional process in that respect. And one of the exciting things that just happened about 2 weeks ago, this is sort of interesting for folks who are thinking about Indigenous lands and Indigenous land back, but you can see the river. This is John Oberholzer Dent, who is the water quality biologist working for the tribe. They sample the river for water quality for about 250 river miles. And the tribe is the only one that's really gathering that data. And he took this picture during their sampling. You can see that sediment. So there's new land that's being exposed by draining the dam reservoirs. And just 2 weeks ago, the state of California made an announcement that they were going to give 2,000 acres of this sort of exposed land to the Shakta Indian Nation, which is a different nation from the Cutter tribe, just upriver. But this is sort of an exciting, unprecedented shift around Indigenous land back in California that's been facilitated through the dam removal as well. So I want to say Yotpa, or thank you to everyone for listening. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I'm hoping that you can hear the voices of my collaborators who are listed here, who are doing this work, and very much also thinking about the youth and the youth who are continuing to learn cultural traditions around salmon and traditional foods. So thank you for listening. I'm glad for questions.
Thanks. I mean, that was really fascinating. I think in the Indian context, we're still in the process of trying to build more dams. So it's really refreshing to see an example of a dam actually being removed with due sensitivity to Indigenous people's aspirations and their yearning to get back to their culture. So what the question I had was, in this entire process, did you have to deal with power relations within the community that you're working with?
Yeah.
And could you give us a sort of a glimpse into that?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, communities are always complicated. I think no matter what country you're in or what nation you're working within, it helps that the team I was working with was a mixed team. So the way that we work with the Cutter tribe, and I helped develop some of these protocols 15 years ago around tribal research governance policies. So we have 2 oversight committee members who are themselves working with the tribe, who are part of our research team. And so they help guide us as visitors and guests in sort of knowing how to operate within the community. It doesn't mean we always get it right, but it usually means we have better chance of fixing things if we make an error. But there's a lot of differences in the districts, in the different council districts, different people and different families. And so it helped us a lot to work with the scoping process so we could go and introduce ourselves in different sections of the community, not just in one place. It helped us a lot that we worked with youth, because everyone cares about the youth. It's like a way to get people together. Even if they're arguing about one thing, you can say the youth and investing in the youth is important. And that was really helpful. And it also helped us we defined the Cutter community broadly, both as formal members of the community and descendants. So we tried to maintain a broader view. But it's always complicated working in community, and we did our best. We continue to do our best communicating what we're finding, and we also created a website so that the information, when people signed up to say we want to do the survey, we could share. We'll put the information on this website. You'll be able to find what we learned. That's another challenge in community work, is making sure the work gets back to communities. Sometimes you even go and present it out, but not everyone's there. So those are some of the things that we did to ameliorate some of the challenges in community, and to be mindful of, perspectives coming from tribal government and perspectives from cultural practitioners. It's a really wide set of interests. And I'm excited to hear how you do this in your work, Venkat. So let's talk about that. Hi.
Hi, I'm Rashmi.
Rashmi.
Lovely work, and I mean, it's very refreshing to see this thing, as Venkat said, that because in India, there have been several people fighting against even building dams, and state has been reacting very brutally. I mean, not listening to them, and several people have lost their villages, livelihoods, everything. So.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear what was state's response against these protests for dam removal, and I also wanted to know more about the livelihood aspects. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Rashmi, I want to acknowledge that I think, these dams it was the removal opportunity for these dams is not the same as like the removal opportunity for large mega dams that are producing power for a lot of people. So these are dams that they came up for a relicensing process after being in use for 50 years. And one of the impetus that allowed for the argument to take them out, it was twofold. One, the Indigenous leadership part being extremely strong and persistent. The other was an endangered species issue, where they built the dams without fish passage, and there's now endangered salmon. So that was a legal pressure point for enabling the removal of these dams. And they really are no longer providing the same use that they did when they were initially building. We went through, in the States also like a massive dam building period where that was just what you did. You build as much as you can. So that's the political context. And I want to acknowledge that it's a really hard political context with the large dam, and a lot of communities are fighting hard, and there's real repercussions to that fight. And it's very sad to see the impacts on community leaders. So the government response to this was initially, it wasn't like a violent response, but it was sort of dismissive. So when Ron's here, we present together, Ron Reed, he will share, my first experience. They had, hearings to have public comment about, should we take the dams out or not? What do you think? Let's do a big assessment, right? And then Ron would come and speak, and people would listen to his stories, and they would just nod their head, and they said, what a great story. And then they just moved on. So it was very dismissive in that early stage. And some of the scientific collaboration, that report with Ron and Kari Norgard was really impactful. As Ron will tell you this story, that the scientific collaboration was one of the first times that his sort of testimony as a tribal leader sort of was taken up seriously, because it was presented in more of a scientific format. And that hit the newspapers. So that was very important in this context for being able to sort of shift the mindset and have people take the arguments for dam removal seriously. We also had that massive fish kill. So there was a crisis moment where people saw that fish kill, and it was visible, and you could smell the fish, and it was visceral. And so people were incredibly upset. The fish kill happened. I've been told by colleagues at a different tribe down the river, it was right after their world renewal ceremony. So it was like, it had a spiritual effect on people. So all those things were sort of in the political context. And then we also have a legal system that allows you to use the endangered species as a leverage point. So it wasn't simple, but the interesting thing is that in the U.S. context, some of these dams that are mid-sized dams, right, that aren't as useful anymore. They used to be used, for agricultural transport. It's not really that important anymore. Or small dams where it's sort of a check dam even. There's sort of a growing movement to think more about river connectivity as a value that people want. And that idea that connectivity that allows fish to move, that allows, amphibians to move, that allows ecological processes to happen has a value. So there is sort of a growing citizen movement to take out dams where it is politically feasible. I don't know, Rashmi, if that does that speak to some of the context that you're working in?
Like, I just want to know whether this particular dam was big or small, like how big or small it is, and what if I miss, I don't know, like what is the purpose for dam, and what is the impact on downstream community actually? Because if you are removing dam, definitely some impact would be on the on the downstream side, because all the ecosystem developed due to that establishment of dam. So whether that type of assessment has been carried out for that.
Yeah, I meant to check the specs before that, and I apologize. So, I can get the exact size to you, but these are smaller dams, that were built to produce hydroelectricity. They produce a small amount of hydroelectricity in a rural community, and they do not provide significant flood control protection for the communities downstream. And there are 2 dams still upstream where the river continues to be regulated. So the flow from the upper river sections is still controlled at those upper dams. So the full environmental impact assessment that was conducted both in the state of California and in the state of Oregon as neighboring states where the river is moving between those 2 states took into account those issues and studied potential impacts, and overall reached the conclusion that there wasn't going to be a significant impact, or that those impacts could be mitigated.
Thank you.
Yeah, good questions.
I'll just read them out because I don't think people will be able to see them. So the first question is, did you monetarily contribute any money to the tribals after publishing popular science articles like in the Los Angeles Times?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I didn't publish that article. That was a nice LA Times article by staff reporters. And we did, as at our first step in setting up a collaborative research relationship with the tribe in our scoping process, we wrote a grant that was supported by a sort of a tribal development fund at the state level. And that grant went to the tribe to support some of their time and expertise going into, planning the study. So that also allowed us to provide some consulting funds to the tribal researchers that spent time working with us. And I provide, as a private citizen, some funds to the Karuk Tribe's Ecocultural Revitalization Fund. Just got a bunch of T-shirts from them because so they have an endowment fund that they're inviting people to donate towards the tribal revitalization initiatives that include the dam removal project, but also putting cultural fire back on the land and reestablishing prescribed fire as a way to manage the forest, which they've done for a long time. But we have policy in the US federal system that for a long time has shut out fire from the system, and it's created a big state change and a lot of problems. So the Karuk tribe is really a leader at the national level in a lot of these revitalization efforts. And so they welcome donations if anyone is online and interested in that.
I'll just ask the second question. Considering the possibility of change in government in the USA and the likelihood that climate issues might not be a priority, especially given the case of previous administration's withdrawal of support for dam removal, how do you anticipate the future of dam removal projects will unfold?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So some of the initiatives are supported with federal dollars, and so we have an infrastructure funds that have helped to motivate a lot of restoration efforts and tribally led restoration efforts. So that's exciting. It would be a real bummer to lose that. So I'll be honest that my own preference is hoping that we can continue with that kind of federal support. But a lot of support is also, I don't know, Pallavi and I are both students of the Commons and Commons governance thinking. So that that field of study reminds us to think about governance happening in polycentric ways where there's multiple centers of governance. So the state initiatives that are supporting dam removal and restoration work over the long time will still be there. A lot of individual private funders are really excited about this. And there's, I think the ships have left the harbor, right? Like these ideas and the possibility for dam removal in these politically reachable spaces. So it's not for every dam, I don't believe, but the idea of dam removal has captured the imagination for a lot of folks. So I think we'll continue to see movement in this area.
There's a question about whether there were any negative environmental impacts observed from the removal of the dam, and could that have an effect on the indigenous communities? If so, are there any ways to minimize or mitigate those impacts?
Those are great questions. So I think that this is a really important question for any dam removal project. In this case, like I mentioned, these are smaller dams, so we're not really worried about major flooding issues. We're not worried about losing water for domestic use, right? That's not the use of these dams. So it makes sense to take these particular dams out. There have been some really organized efforts to think carefully about sediment effects. So that's a big impact with dam removal. These dams don't have a huge amount of sediment gathering behind them. There's still significant levels, but it's not at the level that you might see in other contexts. So the way that they mitigate the sediment is to think very carefully about when the water is released, and they've released the water and the sediment in our rainy season, so that the idea is that that sediment will flow through. So that is one of the challenges with dam removal, is thinking through the sediment issues and where's that sediment going to go? Will it create impacts? And there are potential negative impacts of that. So a lot of folks really think about this, around timing with flow and sediment, and trying to think about that in a careful manner, to model that and to sort of track in real time what's happening with the fish populations. You don't want the sediment to come through and knock out like a whole cohort of baby fish. So they staggered some of the releases and releasing reservoir water at strategic times. So that,
I think I'll just take one last question. This was also on my mind, actually. Do you think the government would have taken it as seriously if the species in concern was not as economically important like salmon?
So what's interesting is that this salmon run is no longer commercially viable. So the value of the salmon in the Cutter context is more culturally important, both culturally important for the tribes, but also, we have a love of salmon in even the non-tribal context too. So I don't think that economic issue around protecting a commercially viable salmon run is really there, as much as protecting a cultural keystone species, where the value of the salmon is understood as being connected to indigenous cultures and connected to the larger ecosystem with larger benefits. The economic issue around, is it, how much money are these dams really generating with being able to sell hydropower, I think is really important, but it wasn't a lot. So that, trade-off in the decision-making, I think, is real. And in this case, it wasn't it wasn't enough to keep the dams in. And the arguments coming from Indigenous communities leaders over really 20 years, consistently, right? Never giving up on it. Over 3 sets of agreements are pretty impressive in terms of being able to make the political argument for this. So it's kind of an extraordinary piece of maybe one term from it is Indigenous peacekeeping. That some of the tribal leaders really established relationships with folks who were resistant to dam removal in the upper basin. There's sort of a conflict between the idea of folks who want water in the river for fishing, and those who want to be able to use the water for agriculture. And a lot of the relationship building that happened across those two communities was in the context of a political situation where we just have over allocated water. Like everyone's a loser in this system. The agricultural folks are losers, the tribes are losers. Like there's just not enough water to go around. So there was a major motivation for folks to get together and talk and to see each other as people and to say, like, we both have culture that we want to pass on, whether you're a tribal community or a non-tribal community. And that's if you read more about this, I'd be happy to share some stories. But I think what's really inspiring in this time of, a lot of political division and hopelessness is that leadership from folks who decided to get together and talk and said, we have something bigger that we could do here. And the agriculturalists wanted predictability. They wanted to be able to deliver water deliveries. They couldn't even make plans on what to plant because there's just not enough water for really anyone. So this is sort of a real powerful story, I think, at this time. So
We'll just take last 2 questions here.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it has to do with your last thing of that. I don't know how much they are entitled, all these tribes, to really ask or demand for the cleanliness of the river. And how are they organized with environmental organizations or among them? No, if there is really a strong organization that will be demanding the cleanliness of the river against the pollution. And the other small question that I had, it was methodologically. I didn't understand if the 3% of the responses were that you decided to have this 3%, or there were only 3% of response after you spread out your survey.
Yeah.
And if it was that, then why it has so little response? Because it was only 3%. So that would
Yeah,
be like methodological. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that on the first point, it was a massive coalition building effort. So the tribes involved that were most active in leading the campaign, they were all federally recognized tribes. So they have some rights under federal law to be in consultation with federal government about decision making that has a federal nexus, which includes the dam removal process and the dam relicensing process. So they had an in as tribes into legally having rights to participate, but not a lot of power to affect a decision themselves. So so in this case, that initial effort to build political will for the dam removal was tribes bringing in an incredible number of allies and maintaining the leadership while building that collective. And so it was a set of legal settlement agreements that really provided the platform for those sort of relationship building and negotiations among a very large set of folks that included irrigators, that included NGOs, that included tribes and the government. So that was sort of the power building. And then in terms of 3% response rate, we actually consider that to be quite high because we sent out a voluntary survey by postcard. So people responded. We had about 700 responses total, but it's hard doing we had the survey actually online. So people received a postcard, an invitation to respond, and then they would go online to respond if they chose to do so. So we actually look at that as a high response rate for a survey of this type, right? Where where we weren't able to, it's not a household survey where we could go and knock on people's doors. It's really sending it out through the mail and also through Facebook. And that was the best way to reach people because it's a very distributed community. And you can't really go knock on people's doors in this context. It would have been great to do that. So it's not as just we don't claim to have a statistically significant sample to say we're representing the population, but when we look at the sample, we can see it's very diverse. And we did have like a whole range of ages, a whole range of household incomes, a whole range of different geographic distributions, which is pretty cool for this community. So thank you for your question. And I want to hear more about your work because I'm hearing that you might be doing similar things.
Yeah, I thank you, Sibyl, for coming here to A3 and for giving this brilliant talk. I'm sure all of us had a little bit to learn from this and also like incorporate certain things into our works. This is a small token of appreciation from us. This is an in-house production.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, from with Siddhapa heads. So
Wow.
yes.
Thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sibyl.
Thank you to everyone. I'm excited to hear more about your work.